It started with a flyer, bright yellow, bold print, taped onto every mailbox and lamppost in the community, like a warning sign before a storm. Join us in protecting our neighborhood values. Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Most residents skimmed it. Many rolled their eyes, but one woman, Karen Whitmore, read every word like it was a personal summons. President of the Willow Oaks Homeowners Association for the past 6 years, Karen believed that her job wasn't just to maintain the lawns and collect dues. It was to preserve order, excellence, and discipline in a neighborhood that, in her mind, had started to slip into chaos. She adjusted her pearl necklace in the mirror, gave herself a firm nod, and prepared to do battle. What she didn't expect was that her latest crusade wouldn't be with a neighbor about an unapproved paint color or a garden gnome. The principal of Willow Oaks Elementary School, and that it would spiral into a war that would grip the entire town. The issue, according to Karen, was blatant institutional negligence. A third grader named Molly Hendricks had walked to school with purple-dyed hair and mismatched socks. It wasn't a dress code violation, at least not according to the school, but Karen took offense. She claimed Molly's appearance was distracting, unkempt, and not in line with the values our neighborhood stands for. When the school principal, Mr. James Carter, responded to her initial email with a polite but firm explanation that the school supported self-expression and creativity, Karen interpreted it as defiance. She printed the email exchange, highlighted key phrases, and passed them out at the emergency HOA meeting, like evidence in a courtroom. Her voice rang out through the community hall. If the school cannot uphold discipline, how can we expect our children to grow into respectful citizens? This is a direct threat to our neighborhood culture. Mr. Carter, a calm and principled educator with over 15 years of experience, had dealt with difficult parents before. But this was different. Karen wasn't Molly's mother. She wasn't even remotely connected to the student. Her vendetta stemmed purely from a belief that the school was failing to uphold the high moral standards of the Willow Oaks community. Standards that, in truth, were more about personal control than collective values. When Karen began sending weekly letters to the school board, demanding Mr. Carter's resignation, it became clear that this was more than just a disagreement. It was the start of a campaign. Soon, Karen launched a blog titled Standards Matter, Restoring Order in Education, which rapidly gained followers among like-minded residents. Some parents found themselves reluctantly nodding along, worried about what their own children might do if left unchecked. But Principal Carter wasn't backing down. His weekly newsletters to parents doubled as essays on inclusivity, freedom of expression, and the importance of creating safe learning environments for all students. If we teach children to fear judgment for being themselves, he wrote, we teach them to suppress creativity, confidence, and ultimately their identity. That is not the kind of school I'm willing to lead. His words ignited support, especially from students and younger parents who'd long felt stifled by Karen's rigid rules in the neighborhood. They organized a peaceful walk-in at the school, where over 100 kids wore mismatched socks and colorful clothes to show solidarity with Molly. Karen saw it as a deliberate act of rebellion orchestrated by the principal. She responded by calling a press conference in her driveway, naturally with reporters from the local paper, a few bloggers, and a YouTuber who specialized in suburban drama. Standing in front of her meticulously trimmed hedges, she declared that the school is no longer a safe space for proper family values, and accused Carter of radicalizing students. The soundbite spread like wildfire, and within hours the school board was fielding calls from angry, confused parents and baffled reporters. Carter stood his ground. This isn't about rebellion, he told the board calmly. It's about growing up in an environment that celebrates diversity without shame. The situation escalated. Karen filed a formal complaint against Carter, citing negligence, community standards violations, and emotional manipulation of minors. Her documentation spanned over 40 pages, including grainy photos of the walk-in, snippets from the school's social media, and even quotes from the children she had interviewed on her own. The board, bound by process, had to open an inquiry, much to Carter's frustration and disbelief. Meanwhile, Karen's supporters began patrolling the school grounds from afar, noting any infractions they could record. Kids started whispering, About being watched, teachers found themselves second-guessing every classroom activity, and the atmosphere at Willow Oaks Elementary shifted from open to anxious, but resistance was forming. Parents who supported Carter began to push back, not with anger, but with organized advocacy. A group called Let Kids Be Kids emerged, printing t-shirts, hosting storytime events, and creating a counter-narrative to Karen's campaign. Students designed posters celebrating uniqueness and individuality, placing them in classroom windows and hallway walls. Even the PTA, typically apolitical, took a stance in support of Principal Carter, writing a public letter defending his leadership and encouraging the community to stand against micromanagement disguised as moral stewardship. Karen, however, doubled down. She used HOA funds questionably to host a values and education seminar in the community center, inviting speakers who championed traditionalist views. The turnout was large but polarized. What was meant to be a quiet session turned into a debate as parents from both sides showed up, some shouting, some pleading, many simply exhausted. The HOA board, which had always supported Karen out of fear more than agreement, began to fracture. 2 members resigned, stating they could no longer be complicit in neighborhood overreach. A third sent an anonymous letter to the newspaper, describing Karen's behavior as dangerously obsessive. Carter kept his cool in public, but the stress was evident in his thinning patience, his long silences in meetings, and the dark circles under his eyes. He loved his job, his students, and what the school stood for, but he had never expected to be dragged into an ideological turf war. "It's not about hair color," he told a local reporter in a candid interview. "It's about control. Who gets to define what's normal, and why are we letting fear dictate how children are treated?" That line became the headline of the piece, and by the next day, it was trending on local social media. The battle lines were drawn deeper than ever. Karen sent a letter to every HOA member, urging them to petition for the school board to vote Carter out. In response, over 300 parents signed a petition to remove Karen from the HOA board. Meetings grew tense. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Children began to pick up on the tension at home, mirroring their parents' divided loyalties. It had started with a flyer and a child's purple hair, but it had become a symbol of something much bigger, a fight for the soul of a neighborhood and maybe even a generation. Now, the community stands at a crossroads. Will Willow Oaks cling to the comfort of strict, outdated norms, or will it embrace a messier, more inclusive future? The next HOA vote, the next school board meeting, and the next parent-teacher conference will all play a role in deciding what happens next. But one thing is certain, the fight is far from over. Are you ready to see how deep this battle goes? Because what's coming next won't just test rules, test loyalties, truths, and the limits of power itself. Tension settled over Willow Oaks like humidity before a thunderstorm, heavy, clinging, invisible yet impossible to ignore. The second week after the public petitions were filed, the community felt itself unraveling at the seams. Neighbors who once exchanged cheerful waves now stared each other down from across hedges and driveways. Children sensed the shift in their homes and classrooms, where conversations about fairness and respect were now laced with the unspoken anxiety of grown-up conflict. Principal James Carter continued his quiet leadership, refusing to turn the school into a battleground, but he couldn't ignore the ripple effect the HOA campaign was having on the students. Office visits were up. Teachers reported rising tension between kids, some echoing their parents' opinions with alarming clarity. "My mom says your dad's trying to ruin the neighborhood," a 5th grader told another during recess. Said purple hair is for freaks. Words stung, not just for the children, but for the adults who had hoped the school might remain neutral ground. Karen Whitmore was refining her next move like a general studying maps before battle. She'd lost 2 allies on the HOA board, but 3 remained loyal, or at least 2 intimidated to resist her. At her kitchen table, where a neat stack of typed agendas and complaint forms sat beside a coffee mug labeled "Order Over Chaos," she crafted a new initiative, the Willow Oaks Educational Standards Act, though not legally binding. The document read like a legislative proposal and outlined what she described as acceptable educational practices for a community-funded institution. It called for stricter dress codes, teacher accountability audits, limits on non-academic expression, and community oversight of lesson plans. Karen presented it at the next HOA meeting, waving it in the air with the pride of someone who thought they'd just drafted the Constitution. "We are not trying to control education," she said. "We are trying to restore it to its rightful path." The meeting was packed, standing room only, with parents, teachers, students, and residents filling every available seat and spilling into the hallway. When Carter arrived, there was a moment of audible silence, like a collective breath being held. He wasn't obligated to attend. He didn't answer to the HOA, but he knew the message his presence would send. As he stood in the back, arms folded calmly, Karen launched into her speech, weaving together buzzwords like decency, traditional values, and civic responsibility. When she read aloud from a section of the school's diversity literature, one that encouraged students to explore different cultural expressions and identities, she paused for dramatic effect and said, "Do you want your 8-year-old being taught that rules are optional?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Carter stepped forward, not barging in, not interrupting, just walking slowly down the aisle until he stood before the microphone. Karen didn't move, but her jaw tightened. The room watched. "I'd like to speak," Carter said simply. The audience shifted, some nodding, others folding their arms defensively. What's being proposed here sounds very official. It's dressed up in concern, but what it really is, it's fear. Fear of what we don't understand. Fear of kids growing up differently than we did. Fear that if we don't control everything, we lose everything. He paused, let that hang. But that's not how communities grow. It's how they wither. The room erupted. Not in applause or anger, but in sheer noise-muttered arguments, raised voices, whispered judgments. Karen remained stoic. She thanked everyone for their attendance and announced that the act would be put to a vote at the next HOA session. That gave her 2 weeks. 2 weeks to rally more support, to push her message louder, to turn passive neighbors into vocal defenders of her vision. But she was starting to feel the pressure. Behind closed doors, even her loyalists were asking questions. One of them, a retired veteran named Howard Miller, visited her privately. "Karen," he said slowly, "this has gone beyond property lines. You're taking this personal?" Karen bristled. "It is personal," she said. "This is our home, and homes need rules." But Howard's hesitation rattled her more than she let on. Across the street, a different kind of planning was happening. A group of parents, students, and teachers gathered at the public library to prepare for what they called the Respect Rally. Not a protest, not a rebellion, just a public celebration of the school's values. Posters were made. Speeches were written. Students practiced musical performances and recited poems about kindness and identity. "This isn't about Karen," Carter reminded them. "It's about showing what we stand for, not just what we stand against." The rally was scheduled for the Saturday before the HOA vote. Word spread quickly and local media picked it up. The interviews were scheduled. Hashtags were born. Even former students of Willow Oaks began weighing in online, sharing stories of how Carter had changed their lives, how the school had helped them feel safe when nowhere else did. Karen watched it all with growing fury.
The rally.
The press coverage. The public support it was undermining everything she'd worked for. To her, this wasn't just about Molly Hendricks anymore. It was about authority being challenged, order being laughed at, and her position in the community being questioned. She started working around the clock, knocking on doors, hosting coffee meets, pushing HOA members to see the school as an extension of the neighborhood's standards. "We pay taxes," she argued. "We have a say." But for every handshake she secured, 2 more parents walked away uneasy, uncomfortable with how far she seemed willing to go. The Respect Rally arrived under a bright blue sky and cautious hope. The school field was transformed with banners, booths, and cheerful music. Students wore rainbow ribbons and read stories about empathy. Teachers stood shoulder to shoulder, showing unity. Carter gave a short speech, nothing grand, just a reminder that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you model. Hundreds attended. The energy was peaceful, celebratory, powerful. Local reporters interviewed attendees. And the story aired on the evening news, framing the school as a beacon of community resilience. Karen didn't attend, but she watched from her window, seething, that night. She posted an open letter to her blog. This is what manipulation looks like. She accused the school of turning education into propaganda, of exploiting children for media points. The letter was shared widely, but the comments were mixed. Some praised her for standing her ground, but more questioned the hostility, the tone, the unwillingness to compromise. One comment read, "Is this really about the school, or your need to control it?" That one stung. She didn't reply. The next HOA meeting was days away. Karen prepared feverishly, assembling binders, diagrams, and talking points. She convinced the remaining board members to allow her 30 minutes of uninterrupted presentation time, which she used to unveil the Standards Act in full. Charts showing moral decline, testimonials from hand-picked residents, and even a comparison to other neighborhoods where traditional values had been lost. It was dramatic. It was exhaustive. It was frankly overwhelming. When she finished, the silence was thick. Then, unexpectedly, a hand went up in the back. It was Molly Hendrick's father, Tom. A quiet man, rarely involved in community drama. He stood up slowly and spoke plainly. "My daughter has purple hair. That doesn't make her a threat. That makes her an individual. The only reason. She knows that is because of this school, because of Principal Carter. So, with all due respect, I think this whole thing says a lot more about you than it does about him." A few claps followed, then a few more. Karen stared ahead, unreadable. Vote came down to the wire. 51% voted against the Standards Act. It wasn't a landslide, but it was enough. Karen's proposal had been rejected. The room buzzed not with triumph, but with quiet relief. Relief that something had held, that decency had not. Been swallowed by fear. Carter left without saying much. He nodded at a few familiar faces and walked into the night. The weight of weeks finally lifting from his shoulders, but Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. To her, the vote was a fluke, a mistake, something that could be reversed. That night, she emailed her attorney and began drafting a formal grievance against the school district, this time escalating it to the county board. She would take it higher, louder, farther, because in her mind, she wasn't losing, she was fighting back. What began with one flyer and a complaint about a child's appearance was no longer just a community scuffle. It was morphing into a full-scale cultural war, with Karen Whitmore standing at the center like a storm that refused to pass. Principal Carter knew it too. As he sat in his office, that following Monday morning, staring at a new letter of inquiry, on his desk, he understood this wasn't the end. Not yet. By mid-October, the leaves of Willow Oaks had begun to fall, but the tension in the neighborhood only grew heavier. The failed vote on Karen Whitmore's Standards Act had not ended the conflict. It had simply pushed it into another arena. Principal James Carter focused on steadying the school climate. Karen moved her battle to the county level. She filed a formal grievance with the County Education Oversight Committee, accusing Carter and Willow Oaks Elementary of ideological bias, discrimination against community values, and emotional coercion of minors through psychological grooming. The language was severe, legally thin, but alarming enough to warrant a preliminary review. Carter was notified by mail, formal envelope delivered by courier that included a 6-page letter and a list of procedural questions he would be required to answer within 10 business days. He closed his office door and sat in silence for a long time before calling the school board president. "She's taking this beyond us," he said quietly. "She wants a war." At the same time, Karen's blog Standards Matter had grown from a neighborhood curiosity into a minor media fixture. Local news stations began picking up on the controversy, framing it as a clash between traditionalism and progressivism in suburban America. Karen, never kamasai, gave interviews on her front porch, often with an American flag in the background and a golden retriever curled at her feet. Her talking points were rehearsed, sharp, always returned to one central theme. We're not trying to suppress individuality. We're trying to protect childhood from chaos. She appeared on 2 podcasts, was quoted in 3 online op-eds, and even earned a brief invitation to speak at a local parent advocacy summit. Her supporters were energized, more vocal than ever. They began writing their own letters to the county board, echoing Karen's concerns, sometimes with language that bordered on conspiracy. "There's an agenda at work," one letter claimed. "They're trying to reprogram our kids." But for every supporter Karen gained, more people in the community began to feel the fatigue of her crusade. Teachers were exhausted, emotionally drained from walking on eggshells. The PTA president stepped down, citing mental health reasons. Parents who once felt indifferent now found themselves choosing sides not because they wanted to, but because neutrality had become impossible. Even children, sharpened and attuned to the undercurrents around them, whispered to each other in hallways, repeating fragments of arguments overheard at dinner tables. "My dad says Mr. Carter's going to get fired," one said. "Well, my mom says Karen's crazy," another replied. The classroom wasn't a battleground, but the walls were growing thin. Despite it all, Carter refused to falter. He answered the county's questions with calm professionalism, submitted every document requested, and even welcomed an unscheduled visit from the oversight liaison with grace. During that visit, a fifth-grade student named Lily approached the liaison during recess and asked, "Are you here to make Mr. Carter leave?" The liaison had paused, unsure how to answer. Lily added, "He's the only adult I trust to talk to when I'm scared." The liaison wrote that detail into her report. It didn't make headlines, but it mattered. Carter kept doing his job, not with grand gestures, but with presence, checking on teachers, visiting classrooms, supporting students quietly. He didn't campaign. He led. Karen, on the other hand, doubled her efforts. When she heard about the oversight visit, she sent a 52-page supplemental report to the county, citing new claims including student indoctrination through art projects. Her blog posts became more dramatic. One was titled "The Wolves in Our Schools," another "How Much Chaos Are You Willing to Accept?" She began holding weekly live streams on Facebook, reading selected comments from concerned parents, some of whom weren't even from Willow Oaks. The algorithm fed her exposure, and strangers began to weigh in on the neighborhood dispute, as if it were national news. One viral clip, showing Karen confronting a mother outside the school gate about parental neglect, caused outrage on both sides. The mother, whose son was nonverbal and wore bright sensory-friendly clothes, had filmed the encounter and posted it with the caption, "This is the real order she's fighting for." The video drew over 500,000 views in a week. The school board called a closed session to address the escalating tensions. Security was quietly increased on campus. Counselors were brought in not only for students but for staff. Carter, for the first time since the entire ordeal began, started thinking about whether staying was sustainable. "It's not that I'm afraid," he confided in his assistant principal. "It's that I'm starting to wonder if the constant noise is robbing these kids of what they really need: peace, stability, space to breathe." Karen sensed the shift, sensed that the longer this dragged on, the more public sympathy leaned away from her, so she changed tactics. She began attacking the parents instead. "Where are the real adults?" she asked in a blog post. "Why are you letting a bureaucrat tell your kids how to think?" She cited discipline records public ones and posted statistics without context to imply a breakdown in school structure. The implication was clear. Carter's leadership wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous. But that post backfired. One of the parents named in the article threatened legal action. A local attorney sent Karen a cease and desist letter, which she posted on her blog as evidence of silencing tactics. But the damage had already been done. People who once quietly agreed with her began to back away. "She's gone too far," one neighbor said. "This used to be about hair dye. Now it's a witch hunt." Still, Karen wasn't done. With the county board decision looming, she organized what she called a community march for standards. She designed banners, ordered matching shirts, and invited followers from outside neighborhoods to join. But on the day of the march, fewer than 30 people showed up. A handful were HOA members, the rest unfamiliar faces. Some neighbors stood on their porches and watched, shaking their heads. One even turned on a sprinkler as the group passed by, not maliciously, just tired of the spectacle. A child watching from a school window whispered, "Is she really still doing this?" That night, Carter received an email from the county board. Their review was complete. The report was brief, but clear. No violations of policy or ethics found. Leadership remains with Principal Carter. No further action recommended. He read it 3 times to be sure, then leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. It was over, or at least the official part was. But he knew better than to expect silence from Karen. She received the news with her lips pressed tight and her hands clenched. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She went to her laptop and wrote a post titled, "When Systems Fail." In it, she claimed the process was rigged, the board corrupt, the entire educational system compromised. She announced she would be stepping back from her HOA role to focus on national advocacy. It sounded like a graceful exit, but everyone knew it wasn't. It was a retreat disguised as redirection. The very next day, she removed the HOA. President signed from her front yard? Within a week, the board appointed a new acting president, Howard Miller. His first act was to call a town meeting to restore unity and rebuild trust. In that meeting, something shifted. It's not because of a vote or a speech, but because people began talking to each other again. The room buzzed not with accusations, but with concern, hope, and fatigue finally giving way to healing. Carter attended quietly, sitting in the back saying little. But when Howard asked if he had anything to share, Carter stood and spoke just 12 words. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to teach and listen." Applause followed, not thunderous, not theatrical, just honest. The kind of applause that meant something had truly ended. Maybe something else could begin. As autumn gave way to winter, the neighborhood began to breathe again. Karen's blog still posted now and then, but fewer people read it. The energy that had once surrounded her campaign faded into the background noise of a town ready to move on. The school flourished in small ways. An art show hosted by 3rd graders drew record attendance. A kindness campaign led by 5th graders made local news. And a student who once feared speaking in class now read a poem at the school assembly. But underneath it all, question lingered. How far can one person go in the name of standards before the community itself begins to crack? And more importantly, how do you stop that crack from becoming permanent? This was not just about one school or one principal. It was a story about control, fear, courage, and the power of community to either unite or divide. Karen may have stepped back, but the forces she stirred would take much longer to settle. Some scars were invisible, others more obvious, but all served as a reminder. A neighborhood is not built on rules alone. It's built on trust, and trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to rebuild. The quiet after a storm is never truly silent, carries with it the echoes of thunder. The damp smell of earth turned upside down in the wary eyes of those who have seen how quickly everything can unravel. Willow Oaks entered that silence. Cautiously, like a town emerging from behind closed doors after a tornado warning, the HOA, now under Howard Miller's even-handed leadership, shifted its tone drastically. Monthly meetings turned into civil, almost dull affairs focused on landscaping, street maintenance, and holiday lighting plans. The polarizing topics that once dominated every conversation were now off the agenda. People weren't eager to revisit the war that had divided them. Still, the name Karen Whitmore hovered in the background like a specter. And though her influence had visibly receded, it wasn't forgotten. Her front yard, once manicured with a perfection that screamed control, grew slightly overgrown. Her porch light stayed off. Curtains remained drawn during daylight hours. It was as if the house itself had turned inward, mirroring its occupants. Retreat at Willow Oaks Elementary. The damage was harder to assess. On the surface, things seemed calm. The teachers smiled again, though more carefully. Students returned to their routines, but something about their chatter was quieter, more measured. The respect rally had been a morale booster, and the county boards. Ruling had lifted a weight, but healing wasn't linear. Carter knew this. He had seen it before, conflict leaving subtle bruises long after the visible wounds had healed. He made time for one-on-one check-ins with every staff member, not to probe but to listen. He brought in a conflict resolution counselor for the student body, and quietly. Encourage restorative conversations in classrooms where tensions had lingered. This is what rebuilding looks like, he told the faculty during a Thursday afternoon. Meeting, it's slow, it's personal, and it's worth it. But not everyone welcomed the new calm. For some, particularly the few who had stood firmly with Karen throughout the chaos, this new era felt like a quiet erasure of their beliefs. They weren't enough to cause disruption, not anymore, but they remained on the fringe, watching, whispering, waiting for what they perceived as the next inevitable shift. Among them was Brenda Lomax, Karen's closest ally during the Standards Act campaign. Brenda, who had once proudly worn a neighborhood first pin, now kept a low profile, but her discontent simmered. Her home not official HOA meetings just concerned citizens getting together over coffee. They discussed how things had gotten out of hand and how they might recenter the neighborhood. At one such gathering, Brenda shared that Karen was considering starting a new organization, the Suburban Values Alliance, a county-wide watchdog group meant to influence local school boards and neighborhood policies. "It's not over," Brenda whispered. "It's just beginning." Meanwhile, Karen herself had entered a strange, isolated phase. No longer the center of local attention, she'd begun working on a book. It was part memoir, part manifesto, titled Lines in the Sand. How I Fought Back Against Cultural Collapse. She wrote late at night, often by the soft glow of her dining room lamp, sipping wine and rereading old emails and blog posts for inspiration. The chapters took on an increasingly defensive tone. Each page a layer of justification, her version of events painted in stark contrast to reality. In her manuscript, Carter became a shadowy figure of unchecked authority, the school a breeding ground of ideological corruption. The HOA vote, a betrayal orchestrated by cowards. Writing the book gave her purpose, but it also deepened her resentment. Every page hardened her convictions. Every sentence widened the gulf between her and the community she once claimed to defend. Outside that shrinking world, life moved on. The school hosted a winter showcase, and dozens of families filled the auditorium to watch their children sing, dance, and share stories they had written themselves. One student, Molly Hendricks, the girl with the purple hair who had unwittingly sparked it all, stood center stage and read a poem titled, "I Am Still Me." It was raw, powerful, and ended with the lines, "You can't erase a kid with rules that hide your fear. Because even when I'm quiet, my colors will be clear." The audience rose in applause. Carter, standing off to the side, wiped a tear from his eye. The moment felt like a victory not over Karen, but over silence. Still, the question remained. What would happen if Karen came back, not quietly through blogs or whispers, but publicly in the flesh? That question was answered one gray morning. In February, when Carter walked into the front office and found her standing at the receptionist's desk, she wore a black coat, her hair pulled into a tight bun, and held a sealed manila envelope. "I'm here to request access to curriculum records," she said flatly. "Under the state's transparency policy." The receptionist, startled, looked at Carter, who stepped forward calmly. "Karen," he said gently, "the district has a process for that. You'll need to go through the proper channels." "I am," she replied coldly, placing the envelope on the counter. "Just making sure my request doesn't get lost like my last one." She turned and left without another word. The staff was rattled. The silence she left in her wake was louder than any speech. Carter, however, refused to panic. He filed the request with the district and prepared for whatever she planned next. But strangely, nothing happened. Weeks passed, and Karen's blog remained quiet. No posts, no interviews, no live streams. It was as if she had gone dark. Carter, though wary, felt a cautious optimism. Maybe this was her way of letting go. Maybe. The fire had burned itself out. Then came the email, sent to over 300 residents of Willow Oaks, including Carter, teachers, and the entire school board. Subject line: "The truth you haven't heard." It was a PDF attachment, 98 pages long, containing a draft of Karen's manuscript. Names were named. Accusations were renewed. It painted the community as weak, the school as corrupted, and Carter as a manipulator cloaked in charm. The response was immediate. Parents forwarded the email to each other in shock. Teachers, some of whom were described in the book as complicit educators, called the union. The school board convened an emergency session to discuss whether the document constituted defamation, but something unexpected happened. The community didn't erupt in chaos. Instead, it responded with clarity. Parents wrote public letters in support of Carter. Teachers posted a collective statement online, reaffirming their dedication to education grounded in compassion, truth, and inclusion. Even Howard Miller spoke during the board meeting. "This isn't truth, it's bitterness set to print," he said, holding the manuscript in one hand. "And I think we've all had enough bitterness for one lifetime." No lawsuits were filed. No protests flared up. The email meant to ignite a second fire fizzled. Karen didn't show up in public. After that, her house stayed dark. Rumors swirled she was moving. She was taking her book to a publisher. She was planning a national speaking tour, but none of it materialized. In the absence of drama, the neighborhood focused inward again. Spring approached. Kids returned. To sports, parents to potlucks, neighbors to cautious small talk that gradually rebuilt trust. The scars were still there, but they no longer bled. One afternoon, Carter received a letter. No name on the envelope, just block handwriting. Dot. Was a single page. "You won, but don't think you're right. The world is watching." He placed it in a drawer and locked it away, not from fear, but to ensure it didn't take up more space than it deserved. That week, during a fifth-grade classroom discussion about community and leadership, a student asked, "Mr. Carter, how do you know when someone is really trying to help and not just control things?" He paused, then smiled. "When they listen more than they talk, and they lift people up instead of pushing them down, and when they're still standing by you, even when it's hard." The room was quiet for a beat, then a hand went up. Another. Student asked, "Do people ever change?" Carter looked out the window, where the first spring flowers had started to bloom. "I can," he said, "but only if they want to." Spring arrived in Willow Oaks like a breath finally exhaled. The air grew warmer, flowers bloomed along the sidewalks, and children's laughter returned in full as if the cold silence of conflict had finally thawed. The neighborhood, once fractured by tension and suspicion, was slowly learning to exist again, not perfectly, not without memory, but with an openness that felt new. The HOA under Howard Miller held a community picnic for the first time in 3 years. Families came out in droves. There were lawn games, barbecue stands, even a small band playing near the lake. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months exchanged food and pleasantries. A sense of cautious unity filled the air, like people still remembering they'd once been enemies, but now choosing not to act like it. For Principal James Carter, watching from a picnic table near the playground, it was one of the first moments in a long while that felt unburdened. He saw Molly laughing near the dunk tank, a teacher chatting with 2 former PTA moms who once had stood on opposite sides of Karen's crusade. The ripples of chaos were fading into calmer waters, but the peace was not total. There were still those who looked over their shoulders, who spoke in lowered tones when Karen's name came up, who wondered what became of her after the failed email blast and the quietly distributed manuscript. Karen Whitmore had indeed receded, but not entirely disappeared. She had moved her attention away from Willow Oaks and directed it toward broader ambitions. Her book, after several rejections, was eventually self-published online under a new title, Guardrails, A Mother's Fight for America's Moral Foundation. It didn't make waves, not nationally, not even locally, beyond the initial whispers. The blog was updated sporadically, its readership down to a fraction of what it had once been. Occasionally, her name surfaced in county comment sections or distant Facebook groups, often followed by arguments between strangers. But in Willow Oaks, her house remained occupied, though dim.
How?
Some said she had taken up consulting. Others whispered she was writing a second book, but most people had stopped wondering. Karen had become something closer to a myth and echo of a battle no one wanted to fight again. Yet myths have a way of lingering, and even in retreat, Karen had changed the neighborhood. The memory of what happened, the division, the fear, the resilience had carved itself into the collective identity of the place. At Willow Oaks Elementary, Carter oversaw the final semester of the school year with a steadier hand than ever. He walked the halls each morning, exchanging smiles with students and brief words of encouragement with staff. The school had implemented new policies, not in response to Karen's complaints, but to help strengthen communication with parents and create proactive spaces for student voices. A rotating student council began hosting monthly forums where kids discussed everything from cafeteria food to Kindness Week themes. Carter sat in the back of every meeting, just listening. Sometimes a student would turn and ask him a question. Directly, most times they didn't need to. They were learning how to lead themselves. And that was the whole point. One Friday afternoon, after the final bell rang, Carter sat alone in his office, reviewing a letter he'd received from the district superintendent. It was an invitation to join a pilot leadership program focused on community healing in divided school zones. The irony wasn't lost on him. He hadn't chosen this path, but it had chosen him. After a long pause, he folded the letter and slipped it into his briefcase. He wasn't sure if he'd accept. He'd loved his school, his students, the daily rhythm of ordinary work. But he also knew that what they had lived through wasn't unique. Other schools, other principals, other students were walking through the same storm. Maybe this story could help someone else find their way out. Around that same time, Brenda Lomax hosted one final gathering in her living room, though it didn't go the way she'd hoped. Only 6 people came. Of those, 2 left. Early, another refused to speak. Brenda tried to reignite the spark of outrage, reading aloud excerpts from Karen's book and asking if they still believed in the mission. But the mission had changed, or rather the neighborhood had. People weren't interested in fighting anymore. They were tired. They wanted soccer games and clean sidewalks, not political posturing. When the meeting ended, Brenda sat alone on her porch for nearly an hour, watching the sun dip behind the trees, wondering if conviction meant anything without followers. In late May, as the school year neared its end, Carter received a visitor he didn't expect. It was Karen's husband, Thomas, a quiet man who had rarely been seen during the height of Karen's campaign. He arrived unannounced, stood stiffly in the office, and politely asked for a private word. Carter led him into the conference room, unsure what to expect. "She's not well," Thomas said plainly, folding his hands. "Not in a way most people would notice. But I thought you should know she still checks the school's website every day. Still reads the newsletters. She says she's just watching out," but he trailed off, eyes downcast. "I don't think she'll ever let it go." "Not really." Carter nodded slowly. "We all held on longer than we should have." There was a long pause. Thomas stood to leave, then stopped. "She may never say it, but I think part of her regrets what it became. I think she thought she was saving something, and when that crumbled, she didn't know who to be anymore." Carter didn't respond with judgment. Just silence and a simple, "Thank you for telling me," and that was all. Thomas left, and Carter sat alone for a long while after processing. Not the words themselves, but the weight they carried. Sometimes the aftermath doesn't look like resolution. Sometimes it just looks like people surviving their choices. The school year ended with the usual joy. Graduation ceremonies, yearbook signings, field day chaos. Carter gave a speech to the 5th graders about courage, not the kind you shout, but the kind you show when you keep doing the right thing even when it's hard. He didn't name names. He didn't reference the war. But every adult in the room knew what he meant. The applause afterward was heartfelt, not loud, not wild, but real. That summer, Willow Oaks moved forward. New families moved in, unaware of the storm that had passed through. Old neighbors mended fences both literally and figuratively. The HOA began planning a community mural project, and a surprising number of people volunteered. It was as if everyone, in their own way, was trying to paint over what had been, a new layer of color, of shared memory, of healing. At the center of it all was Carter, who continued showing up not as a hero, but as someone who believed that schools, like communities, are gardens. They need care, patience, and time. And sometimes they need to be protected from the very people who claim to love them most. Karen never returned to public life in Willow Oaks. Her name faded from agendas. Her stories became cautionary tales told quietly among parents. But the lessons she left behind remained. Maybe that, in the end, was the true gift she gave without meaning to. A reminder that fear disguised as conviction can do real harm. That power without empathy is poison. And that real strength, the kind that builds rather than breaks, is quiet, steady, and built from love. This story may have ended, but the world is full of Willow Oaks neighborhoods where the battle between fear and progress plays out in living rooms, school hallways, and board meetings. The question is no longer whether a Karen will rise. The question is how we choose to respond when she does. So here's the call to action. Listen more, fear less. Protect the spaces where children grow. Speak the truth even when it trembles in your throat. And when the voices of division shout the loudest, be the one who stays, who steadies, who loves enough to rebuild. Because the real fight was never between a Karen and a principal. It was and always will be about who we become when our communities are tested and whether we choose to come back together when it's over.